Sailors of Reddit, what's the weirdest, creepiest thing you've seen at sea? During WW to my dad, a wireless operator on a minesweeper passed by a German pilot, waving frantically from his still-floating aircraft in the North Atlantic. They were under strict orders not to stop because of the danger of subs, so they left the poor guy to certain death. My dad died a couple of years ago, but this incident haunted him throughout his life. He wept about it even in his last few hours. My granddad was on county-class cruisers escorting convoys to Russia. They saw a Russian flying boat with engine difficulty ditch near their convoy, so they closed to assist. But the flight crew hadn't secured their depth charges properly and one was knocked loose and detonated under the plane. He said it was the weirdest thing. The crew suddenly stopped swimming and, when they fished them out, there wasn't a mark on them, but they'd been killed stone dead by the pressure. I came across a man who'd hung himself on his boat 5 or 6 miles offshore about 4 or 5 years ago. The eerie and truly creepy part was realizing what it was. We just saw a boat out in the middle of oceans nowhere without anything other than blue horizon in sight at the break of dawn, and there was fairly thick fog, as it had rained the night before. Realizing that the figure hanging from the boom was a man was one of the most haunting things I'll ever see. My uncle was lost at sea while sailing. He went missing near the Marquesas, and there was a big search and lots of people involved and emails going to all family with updates. They found his boat sunk, missing the raft. My cousin told me that he thinks his dad committed suicide and sunk his boat beforehand on purpose. He would have enjoyed this one last mystery. So the point of my story is that sometimes I think people like to get as far from people as possible before they off themselves. When diving, a huge seiner net drifting towards you. It wasn't anchored or attached to anything, just a huge whirling cloud of death, full of barnacles and dolphin skeletons and decomposing fish. This is more horrifying than most of the horror fiction I've seen or read. A moving wall of decay that enfolds you, traps you inside, and eventually makes you a part of it. Those poor animals. It was a foggy night off the shore of Long Island, and I was on a 75-foot schooner. The fog was so thick that you couldn't see more than 10 feet in front of you. The captain tells me there is no point to continue my watch at the bow of the ship and him and I start talking at the stern. About that time there is thunk on the side of the ship. We both turn to see a figure dressed in black flowing robes walking towards us on the outside of the ship. The robes were scratching down the outside of the ship. It keeps coming closer and is high enough in the air that the top was about even with our heads. It turns out that it was just a black flag to mark a lobster pot. But for those first few seconds it was terrifying. Lol, not me. But my father back in his commercial fishing days noticed that there was a t-shirt in the middle of his net after one tow. After a little investigation he found that it was not a shirt, but a human torso wearing a shirt. He said he was terrified that he would open the net and a head would roll out onto his feet. But it didn't happen. His captain radioed ahead, and they brought the torso back to the docks, where they were met by the police and a coroner. They were eventually able to identify the body based on the clothing as a victim of a plane crash that had occurred fairly recently. My dad said he offered a free lobster to the coroner, who graciously accepted it until he found out that it had been found in the net with the body. After that he got angry and told him to throw it back. Well, the lobster would have likely been eating the dead guy. Lobsters convert dead stuff into lobster. I don't see a huge issue. The sea is a vast and seemingly empty place. Many fail to grasp this when asking questions like, how can you just lose an airplane in the ocean? I found myself on my ship somewhere in the vast expanses of the South Pacific Ocean. We had been cautiously avoiding big storms, which I knew to be all around us out further than that. I can see although our local ocean area was calm and peaceful. I was on watch when I noticed something out there in the distance, bobbing along, that I had never seen before, especially this far from land. As I got closer, I identified what was clearly a makeshift raft made from lashed-together bamboo, with a snapped mast and an empty cooler moored to the deck. Upon this raft was not a soul. The chances of coming across a raft to begin with are small enough in that part of the ocean. Thinking about the persons who once sailed that raft, why they sailed, and how they met their fate, that was what creeped me out. Well, I'm no sailor, but am in the military. On 9/11/2013, I was on a ship in the Red Sea. We were having a ceremony in remembrance of 9/11s, when up floats a dead body right next to the ship. We were all locked down pretty quickly so that they could send out a couple small boats to retrieve it. Never did hear anything more about it. Pretty damn weird if you ask me though. Not a sailor, but I do fish in the Gulf quite often. A few years ago I'm down in the Thousand Islands area SWFL doing some backwater fishing with a buddy, and we hear that thump thump of a helicopter off in the distance. So we look up and watch a Coast Guard chopper trying to catch up to a speedboat. The chopper flies ahead, rotates so its side is facing the front of the boat, and just opens up on the engines of the boat. With a machine gun, boat explodes into fire. I'm guessing it hit a fuel tank, and the chopper starts hovering in a circle of sorts looking for survivors. At this point my friend Dan and I are like, yeah, we should just get the frick out of here. A little later on we did see what looked like a smaller Coast Guard ship heading out to that point. I'm guessing it was some sort of drug smuggling operation out of Cuba. Made for an interesting Saturday afternoon. Not a sailor, however, this was at sea. My dad went boating with some friends down near Rocky Point in Mexico in the mid-90s. They went out late at night to drink. It was incredibly dark apart from the boat lights when suddenly a helicopter flew above their boat, and the local who took them out shut everything off immediately. The helicopter hovered over some water in the distance and dumped a few bodies into the water before flying off. When it was out of sight, the local turned everything back on and shrugged it off, saying, "They do that all the time. Never seen it so close up before." A friend of mine known as Domo was an avid fisherman, and he and his dad used to go out sea fishing whenever they could. A few years ago he told me this story and it creeped to hell of me, so this seems like an appropriate place to tell it. Domo and his dad were on the second night of a trip deep sea fishing, and they decided to get some sleep in the early evening so they could go for whatever fish they were after at around 1 a.m. the best time to get this fish, apparently. Anyway, they only had a smallish boat, but the weather was extremely pleasant and the sea was calm, to the point of stillness, so they figured it would be a great night's fishing for them. Around 12:30 a.m. they started to set their gear up, and as they were on the starboard side getting bait ready, they heard a loud splash on the port side. As there was almost no swell, they figured it was either a large fish or some gear had somehow fallen, and so they went over to have a look. Floating face up in the water only a few feet from the side of the boat was a young woman. They reckon she couldn't have been more than about 30 at the most. She showed absolutely no signs of decomposition, bloating, and there was nothing tangled in her hair, all of which would normally suggest she had been in the water for some time. She was wearing a simple white skirt and a blue-colored strappy top, both of which were clean and apparently looked barely wet again, all indicating she had only just gone in the water. She showed no signs of damage like having been beaten or attacked, and her eyes and mouth were shut. Domo said she looked totally peaceful and like she was simply asleep and just floating on her back in the water. They were both totally freaked out by the whole thing, but reacting more to the need to make sure she was okay instead of just standing there trying to work out where she came from. They tried to wake her up, shouting to her, etc., and they threw a line to her hoping they may catch her enough to pull he back in. She showed no signs of movement, and the splashing around they were making with the rope served only to let her body drift further away from the boat. When she was a few meters away, Domo ran off to grab a fishing rod, hoping they could pull her in that way, and his dad ran to the cabin to try and call a Coast Guard for help. When Domo got back to the side, she had vanished. He frantically searched around and splashed into the water with the rod, thinking she had bobbed underwater, even drifted under the boat somehow, but the body had vanished. Eventually his dad, figuring they couldn't just leave a potential dead, unconscious body floating in the water, jumped in and swam over to where she had last been, hoping he may find her under the surface, but they couldn't find anything. They did eventually drive the boat around in a good half-km circle, but they never saw the body again. The Coast Guard did come out, and obviously Domo and his dad were kind of interrogated to make sure they hadn't dumped the body, but nothing came of it all. The freakiest thing about it all was that the boat was thoroughly checked before they had set out fishing the day before, so they could say with certainty that there had been no woman on board when they set off, either a dead body or a stowaway homeless woman. The apparently fresh state of the body kind of removed the possibility that she had been in the water a while and that they just found the body and they were far enough out from land and nowhere near any other boats that her appearance there was just totally unexplainable, as was the way the body just disappeared. Domo and his dad hadn't been gone more than 20 seconds from the side of the boat, but in that time the body just vanished. They were both really shaken by the whole thing and were most terrified by the fact that her appearance was preceded by the heavy splash in the water, to them suggesting the body had only just entered the water from their own boat. They tell the story now as a kind of "you won't believe what happened to us once" type thing, but it shook them badly and neither has been back to the same fishing spot since.